Hi, welcome back to the lecture. Today's lecture is going to be on early Christianity. We're kind of doing this lecture kind of in the middle, or technically it would be in the middle of the Roman lecture, because Christianity is such a large component of later Roman Empire history and culture. If we take a look at a map, in terms of Christianity's success, Christianity is arguably one of the greatest religious success stories in the ancient and late antique period. It started out as a very small group of believers in the Middle East, primarily located in and around the city of Jerusalem. And then within about a 300-year period, it would explode to basically incorporate and to surround the Mediterranean Sea. In terms of this lecture, I don't necessarily assume that people know a lot about Christianity. And so I like to give kind of a little bit of a cultural background to the time period in which Christianity was born, as well as different components that kind of make sense of the history of Christianity. Now, later Roman Empire culture, in terms of the turn of the period from the Republic to the Empire, we saw a flourishing, if you will, of different different religious traditions. And the largest component of these new religious kind of trends or popular cults were the group of religious groups we call the mystery cults. Now, mystery cults were very popular in Rome because as the Roman Empire expanded, basic polytheistic religion kind of became what I like to use the term homogenized. It became very basic and similar across cultural boundaries in terms of the Roman Empire. And then what developed to kind of spark people's renewed interest in new religious traditions were these so-called mystery cults. You'll see listed on there the cult of Mithra, the cult of Isis, Eastern mystic cults. And what these mystery cults basically revolved around was the idea that there was a basic story or miracle that these individual believers kind of came together to worship around. And these mystery cults had two basic ideas. One, they were cults of initiation, which meant that you would be initiated and then over the course of time and study would be further initiated or learn more about the religious cult as you went along. And secondly, and probably the most important component of these cults, is that they were extremely secretive, in which believers could not discuss the nature of the cult or what went on in the cult in terms of with other people, especially outsiders. And so what we had kind of brewing and growing in the Roman Empire was this growth of a very large segment of believers who were secretive, who were doing, no one knew exactly within these cultural or these cultish centers. And as you might expect, the Roman Empire became increasingly suspicious of these cults and began to target these cults for elimination. Now, the reason why I talk about mystery cults is because when Christianity kind of burst on the scene in the 40s and 50s, AD or CE, for the Roman perspective, this new religion of Christianity is going to be viewed by many as a new type of mystery cult. Now, in terms of Judaism, to give a kind of a background knowledge or background history of what the state of Judaism was at the time period of the birth and lifetime of Christ, Jesus Christ, we have basically four main religious groups kind of leading the Hebrew state or leading the Hebrew religion, that is Judaism. The first group were called the Sadducees. They were basically lawyers of the Hebrew tradition. They focused primarily on written law only, with an emphasis upon temple rituals, and kind of another differentiating feature of their belief system was that they did not believe in an afterlife. Conversely, and opposite to the Sadducees, were the Pharisees, which were again another lawyer class, priestly class of the Hebrew state. They focused on both oral and written law. They did have a belief in the afterlife, and they were more kind of charged with integrating Greek philosophy and Greek learning into the Hebrewistic religious tradition. Our third group are called the Essenes. They are a group that were virtually unknown in most of the medieval and early modern world, primarily because of their nature. They were what we might call ascetic Judaistic practitioners. They believed that it was the next phase of Judaism was to evolve into a meditative, contemplative religious tradition. And to that end, the Essenes kind of isolated themselves from society and culture. The truth of the matter is the really only reason we know about the Essenes was when we have the great discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which kind of indicated the presence of the Essenes and told us a lot about their religious tradition. Now, the last basic group of religious believers in terms of the Hebrew state were known as the Zealots. And the Zealots kind of interpreted the role of Judaism as being a politically and militarily dominant state that would basically lead and kind of secure the fate of the chosen people. And to that end, Zealots were mostly political or action leaders who sought to establish a military dominance in the Middle East. Now, all four of these groups were unified by two basic beliefs. One, that they believed, the Hebrews believed they were the, quote, chosen people, and that they had a special relationship with their God, a relationship that was exclusive to other peoples. And secondly, all of these four groups were expecting the arrival of a Messiah, a religious individual who would lead the Jews into basically a newfound period of peace and prosperity. Now, the problem is, though, that each one of these four groups had a different expectation and belief of what that Messiah would resemble. And basically onto that stage stepped the figure of Jesus, otherwise known as Jesus the Christ. Now, Jesus' message was extremely new, and what might even argue that it was profoundly disturbing in the fact that the message was based on love. Love your enemies, love your neighbors as yourself, love God with your whole heart, soul, and mind. Those are the two commandments that Christ gave. Love God and love your neighbor. And as you might expect, those messages were jarring for the Hebrew people. First of all, Jesus preached a message of love and inclusion, which ran contrary to that idea that the Hebrews were the chosen people. They were chosen, Jesus said, or in terms of Jesus' message, they were chosen to lead others to God, to be, as it says in the Gospels, to be a light upon a hill, and to not bury their light, but to let it shine and to bring that light to others. And that ran very contrary to what the Hebrew tradition was of basically exclusionary nature of the covenant and being the chosen people. And secondly, if that's not enough, one can easily understand the idea, especially in the ancient world, but also today, of loving your enemy, basically turning the other cheek to allow your enemy to strike you, and to basically being inclusionary of even those who hate you and those that persecute you. According to Christianity, Jesus' message was the completion of the old covenant, the passage away of that exclusionary kind of ideology, and the embracing of a new covenant that would basically unify all peoples around the globe. Now, in case you're wondering, I have point number C, which is called the blood libel, which refers specifically to an event in the Gospel according to Matthew, which pertains to the passion and death of Jesus. And the idea of the blood libel was that if you read the Gospel of Matthew, and it's only in the Gospel of Matthew, that the Hebrew people took upon them the blood of Christ, meaning they took upon them the blame for the death of Christ in that curious event in terms of the exchange between Pontius Pilate and the Jewish mob. Now, the reason why that's important is because going further into the Middle Ages, that ideology of the Hebrews being the persecutors of Christ, being the persecutors, if you will, also of the early church, led to a dramatic kind of gulf or gap between the Hebrew peoples, the subsequent survivors of the destruction of the Hebrew state, being the Jews in Eastern Europe and also in Europe proper, and the treatment of those Jewish communities by Christians. It was commonly believed in medieval Christianity that the Jewish people, the Jewish believers, were out to destroy Christianity. They were still out to persecute the followers of Christ, and that also they were looking to basically destroy the Christian church. And because of that, that kind of animosity continued to be perpetuated all the way up into the modern era, which has been used as kind of a justification by some as the cause or the justification for as recent events as the Jewish Holocaust of the 1930s. Now, be that as it may, the life of Christ, of course, is well detailed, not well, but at least detailed in the Gospels of the New Testament. And with the death of Jesus, we have the creation of the Christian church. However, it's important to remember that as its origins, Christianity is, as I call it, Jewish Christianity, which means that basically in order to become Christian, one first had to become Jewish. And that was a major limiting factor that led to the kind of stagnation of the spread of Christianity, especially for males. Non-Jewish males, of course, had to undergo adult circumcision, which was definitely a hindrance and a block to the spread of Christianity. However, after the Council of Jerusalem, circa around the year 50, those Jewish components of Christianity were completely dropped. Christianity separated itself from Judaism completely and became a standalone religion, which led to the spread of Christianity across the Roman Empire. Now, in terms of the organization of the early Christian church, we have the so-called 12 apostles. They were the, quote, leaders of the Christian church, which would most concurrently be equated to being bishops in the Roman Catholic Church today. Now, we also had a designation of what was called a patriarch, and the patriarch was a particular leader who had been ordained and kind of had the power of transference from the head of the apostles, known as Peter. And this idea that Peter was the head of the Christian church, called the Petrine doctrine, that idea perpetuated itself on down through the Christian / Roman Catholic Church, creating the idea of the patriarchs of the church, and the most powerful of those patriarchs being the Patriarch of Rome. Now, in the early church, there were 4 patriarchs, contrary to what the slide says. There were 4 patriarchs until the designation of Constantinople, which was built in the 330s, as a patriarchate. Now, that designation was committed or basically caused by the rulership of Constantine the Great, who kind of equated Constantinople as a patriarchate, even though technically, according to previous tradition, it was not. And the reason why I bring this up is to kind of describe what's going to take place in the years after the fall of the Roman Empire, with the animosity that began to brew between the Patriarch of Rome, who was considered to be a legitimate patriarch, and the Patriarch of Constantinople, who the Western Church, the Roman Catholic Church, to this day, still does not recognize as a true patriarch. And it would be this political squabble that would ultimately lead to the splintering, if you will, or the breaking of the Christian church into what's called the Roman Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church. Now, if we take a look at the spread of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire, initially it was fairly ignored by the Roman government, but over time it became a target for what we call first opportunistic persecution. Later it became a religious persecution that was both sporadic but based upon the religious and belief system of the Christians. To draw the distinction, Nero targeted the Christians not because of their religious beliefs, but because of their nature as being a small, unpopular, kind of mysterious group in the city of Rome, which he targeted because of the allegations against Nero that he had started the Great Fire that led to the death of thousands of people so that he could build his new palace. In order to kind of shift the blame away from himself, Nero targeted the Christians as a minority. And so that's why we call it opportunistic and political rather than religious. However, as Christianity began to grow, the Romans began to identify Christianity as being a negative component of religious tradition within the Roman Empire, and they continued to kind of sporadically persecute it. By the time we reached the 3rd century, and if you remember, that's the time period of the so-called 3rd century crisis, Romans were now looking for definitely elements of Rome that were leading to its destruction, and Christianity was once again kind of targeted as one of those negative elements. And because of that, in the 3rd and 4th century, we see a systemic or a systematic persecution of Christianity, which would take place across in every major urban city of the Roman Empire. This is the time period where we see the largest kind of concentration upon trying to destroy Christianity by the Roman government, which led to the death of thousands of Christians. Now, as we mentioned, however, when we were talking about Constantine the Great, Constantine, when he basically became the ruler of the Roman Empire in 312, he issued an edict called the Edict of Milan, which legalized Christianity throughout the Roman Empire. As time went on, Constantine continued to favor Christianity until eventually converting to Christianity in the year 337. And at that point, upon Constantine's conversion, the religion of Christianity became a state religion and continued to grow. Now, I skipped over, but I will mention it now, the so-called Council of Nicaea. It is considered to be the first worldwide meeting of the Christian church, and it met basically to deal with a particular heresy known as Arianism, which was a belief that Jesus was in fact a demigod or the Son of God as opposed to being fully God. Now, as Christianity continued to grow, its success story continued to kind of build, and eventually it reached its ultimate success when it became the only legalized religion in the Roman Empire by the law code passed by Theodosius the Great in 395. And so if we're keeping track, Christianity's origins from the year basically 50 on up to the year 312, it was persecuted and kind of shunned by the Roman Empire. It first became legal in the Roman Empire in the year 313, and basically 82 years later, it became the only religious choice of the Roman Empire, which meant that whether people knew it or not, they were now forced to be Christian. In terms of what we call heresy, I introduced the idea of heresy because heresy became a predominant factor of importance in terms of later European history. And the cause for that is pretty simple. Our first major heresy was that heresy of Arianism. And what that led to happen is that it led to a kind of a dualistic, if you will, or two forms of Christianity that were operating in the Roman Empire. And that became important because in the fall of the Roman Empire, a lot of the Germanic peoples that would migrate in and try to establish states were actually the wrong form. They were the heretical form of Christianity we call Arianism. And because of that, they had, in terms of the Western world, these Germanic states had a very hard time consolidating and unifying the European people under their control, the former Romans. And that led to political and social instability, which eventually led to the destruction of those precursor states, if you will, that kind of took over Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. And so, that kind of summarizes Christianity to a much simplest kind of description. One could spend weeks, months, or even years talking about Christianity and its different beliefs and its different cultural systems. I think that's good enough for us in terms of kind of understanding Christianity. Obviously, going forward from this period, especially in the section 3 of this course, the Christian church and Christianity itself will be a major focal point as the world of the medieval period, both in terms of Europe and the Middle East, kind of became defined by the story of Christianity and Islam and the interplay and the relationship and the conflict that occurred between the two. But I think we've covered it enough to have a good idea of it, and because of that, we'll leave our discussions of Christianity on to later lectures. Once again, I thank you for listening to this lecture. If you have any questions, please email me and let me know, and I look forward to speaking to you again. Thank you.